welcome you back to the educational webinar series brought to you by WeatherWorks. My name is Nathan Wiles, lead meteorologist and assistant marketing director of the company. Today we will be visiting with our chief meteorologist Jim Sullivan, who manages and produces WeatherWorks long-range forecast products for both the summer and winter months. After a quick recap of the summer so far, Jim will be discussing some of the drivers into what may be another warm and humid summer and active hurricane season. Following this webinar, you will receive a video copy for your review, and you may rewatch this and past webinars on the WeatherWorks YouTube channel. Jim, take it away.
All right, thank you, Nate. So yeah, like Nate said, we're gonna kind of talk about the outlook for the summer and hurricane season, a little bit of what goes into both of those outlooks, and we'll also kind of start by going through some differences between short range and long range forecasts. So jumping right in. What is a short range forecast? This is what you'll get from WeatherWorks or maybe on your TV or on your phone. It's a kind of a short range out to maybe 7 or 10 days, a day by day. Hey, the high temperature will be this, the low temperature will be that. It might rain at this time or that time. Maybe in winter, it's how much snow you're going to get. So, short range forecasts are very detailed, very kind of deterministic, as we say, as in like this is what we think will happen. Whereas long-range forecasts are a little bit more general, maybe a little bit more probabilistic. And the reason for that is just basically it's impossible to predict the day-to-day weather more than about a week and a half or so in advance. So when we're talking about long-range forecasts, we're kind of looking for general patterns that might dominate for a few weeks or maybe months at a time through a season, as opposed to kind of like a day-to-day. So whereas a short-range forecast, I might say, there's a 70% chance of rain at 2 o'clock tomorrow. Maybe for a long range forecast, it's like, we're leaning towards a warm July, or, an active Atlantic hurricane season appears likely, so a little more general, maybe a little more probabilistic than a short range forecast. So let's kind of start with where we've been this spring and summer so far and kind of tie that into where we think we're going. So here's a look at May. It was generally a fairly chilly month across a lot of the country, and it was a fairly dry month across a lot of the country. A couple of exceptions. It was very rainy across the southern plains and the western Gulf Coast. And also there is a little sliver of wetter weather in the month of May, parts of the Northeast, and most of that rain, unfortunately, fell over Memorial Day weekend. Otherwise, it was a fairly dry month of May here in the Northeast. Moving on into what we've seen in June so far as of earlier this week, generally, it's been a very warm month across the country. Again, the South is kind of an exception, and it was an exception in May as well. It's a little bit cooler down there, and also fairly dry across most of the country so far this month. Again, an exception is parts of the South, and also parts of the Ohio Valley have been rainier. So the question is this pattern that we've kind of seen of, kind of warm in the West, and in the north, cooler and wetter in the south, is that going to kind of continue through the rest of summer, or do we see some changes coming? So kind of checking in, a big concern in summer is drought, just because, this is the season where it can dry out really quickly if it doesn't rain. So here's kind of where we are early in the summer. This is as of mid-June, the drought monitor. And big drought in the West. That is a long-lasting drought, and it's becoming very severe in many areas. There's a bad fire season last year out there. Possible we see another bad fire season this summer and fall. It's also rather dry across a good portion of the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes, including the Chicago area, the Detroit area. Elsewhere, the East Coast, again, it's been kind of dry the last few months, but not as bad as out west. So there are pockets where it's drier than average on the East Coast, and either close to a drought or in a moderate drought, especially in upstate New York and northern New England, but again, not nearly as bad as farther west. And then most of the middle part of the country, especially farther south, are not in a drought, because that's the one spot that's been a lot wetter recently. So we'll obviously have to hope that the areas that are drying out get some rain at some point this summer. So starting to dive into the forecast now, what are some drivers that we look at when we're putting together a long-range forecast? The big one is El Nino and La Nina, and that is a temperature and sea surface pressure pattern that develops across the tropical Pacific. Basically, an El Nino is when there are warmer than normal waters across the equatorial Pacific, whereas La Nina is the opposite. The waters are cooler than normal. In terms of that pressure pattern that I talked about, with an El Nino, there tends to be higher than normal pressure near Australia, lower than normal pressure across the eastern Pacific. That results in weaker trade winds. It affects thunderstorms in the tropics. That can drive the pattern and have global implications. So that is what El Nino and La Nina are, and here are the summer impacts for El Nino and La Nina. Typically, El Ninos result in cooler summers across most of the country. La Nina, the opposite. Last summer was a La Nina summer, and it was a very warm summer across most of the country. In terms of precipitation, El Ninos tend to be wetter across the country as a whole, while La Ninas tend to be drier across the country as a whole. Again, there can be local exceptions, and not every El Nino or La Nina is the same, but this is kind of the general pattern we might expect in an El Nino or La Nina summer. So this summer, is it going to be El Nino or La Nina? That's a good question. So we were in a solid La Nina last summer. Through the winter, it was kind of moderately strong in the winter, and as the graph on the right shows, we have kind of warmed up to that neutral area where there isn't an El Nino or a La Nina this summer, and you can see that in the water temperatures on the left as well. You can see kind of in that box there across the equatorial Pacific. There's some cooler water, there's some warmer water, but it all averages out to pretty close to normal in that box. So we're not really going to have an El Nino or a La Nina this summer, which means we have to look elsewhere for some pattern drivers. If anything, coming off a La Nina winter, and with maybe some hint that we'll move back towards La Nina into the fall, maybe this summer has a slight La Nina flavor, which would be kind of warmer across the country, maybe a little bit drier, but I don't think it's going to be a big influence, not like last summer. So given the kind of neutral El Nino or La Nina signal across the Pacific, what are some other areas we can look for clues in the tropics? Because tropical thunderstorms that drive the pattern, they don't just occur in the Pacific, they can occur anywhere across the globe where the waters are warm enough. So a couple areas of warmer water stand out. A big area of warmer water that stands out is across the eastern Indian Ocean and the western Pacific Ocean near Australia, Indonesia, that area. Big warm pool there. And then another one across the southern Atlantic. So both of those areas may focus enhanced thunderstorms. Generally, when the water is warmer, you get maybe more persistent and stronger thunderstorms that, again, can influence the pattern globally. So there is some hint that the atmosphere is responding to these warmer waters. This is a look at where we've had both increased and decreased thunderstorm activity across the tropics over the last 2 months. So kind of late spring into the early summer. And you can see some bullseyes. One is across the western Pacific, and another one is kind of like over the eastern Atlantic, into Africa. So you can argue that these warm pools are already kind of having an impact on the pattern. So I already kind of showed you some El Nino, La Nina graphics, what we typically expect with those couple of features. Can these thunderstorms elsewhere clue us into, maybe different patterns that we might see? And the answer is yes. So this is a forecast model. It's actually a combination of a bunch of models. The rainfall that they're forecasting in the tropics through the summer. And you can see they are suggesting enhanced rainfall kind of where those warmer waters are, across the eastern Indian Ocean, near Australia, Indonesia, and then also from South America across the southern Atlantic into Africa, with generally drier conditions across the tropical Pacific. So the models are kind of picking up on these areas of warmer water in the tropics, driving thunderstorms that can influence the pattern. And basically, how can we kind of tie this into a long-range forecast? The MJO, or Madden-Julian Oscillation is the full name, is kind of a measure of these thunderstorm patterns across the tropics. The MJO is kind of a feature that kind of moves through the tropics, and it can move around the globe. However, it can be especially persistent if the waters are warm in an area, or if thunderstorms are just kind of generally favored in those areas. So the MJO phases that kind of correlate to, let me go back a slide, to these areas of enhanced thunderstorm activity, which again, the models have it, we've already kind of observed this pattern over the last couple months, are phases 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You can kind of see that these phases have kind of enhanced rainfall in the green in the areas where we've kind of been seeing it. and where we might see it. So how can these phases help us? Well, we, not me personally, but, researchers in the past have kind of researched typical temperature and rainfall patterns across the United States that occur with each of these MJO phases. So again, keep these phases in mind. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are ones that might kind of be favored this summer just based on the current conditions and the forecast conditions. And here are how these phases can impact temperatures across the country. So not all the phases are the same, so it is kind of a mixed signal, but there are certain commonalities. One commonality is most of the phases, I would say at least 3 out of 5, if not 4 out of the 5 phases that might be common this summer are warm across the western United States. It's been warm out west so far. I'll show you this in a minute, but some of our forecast models continue to expect it to be warm, and based on the tropical thunderstorms, warmth might be more common across the western United States going forward. A lot of these phases are a little bit cooler across the central or the southern United States. Again, it's not unanimous, but I would say, 3 or 4 of the phases out of the 5 are generally cooler across the southern and central United States, kind of where it's been a little bit cooler so far this summer. And it's a mixed bag on the East Coast. Some of the phases are quite warm on the East Coast, others are cooler. And again, that kind of jives with what we've seen so far. It's been very warm so far this, late spring and summer in New England. But down into the mid-Atlantic and southeast and out towards the Ohio Valley, it has been a mixed bag. It's been very warm and humid at times, but that has been broken by some occasional cool down. So you can already argue that kind of these tropical thunderstorms that I talked about being enhanced in those certain areas are already kind of having an effect on the pattern. And there's a decent chance that might continue going forward. What are the impacts on rainfall in summer? So again, each phase is a little bit different, but certain commonalities. A lot of these phases are fairly dry out west. Every phase has areas of drier weather in the west. Again, they're in a very deep drought, so we've already been seeing this, and there's some potential for that to continue. Most of these phases, I would say 4 out of the 5, or at least 3 of them, tend to be wetter across the Midwest. So that would be beneficial if that happens, because that is an area, if you recall back to where drought is developing, there is some drought in the upper Midwest and Great Lakes. So there's some hope that that can turn through the rest of the summer. And again, a little bit more mixed signals across the south, southeast, and then up the East Coast. Some of the phases are wetter, some of them are drier. And we'll get into what we kind of expect with rainfall on the East Coast here over the next few slides. So that the MJO, the tropical thunderstorms, El Nino, La Nina, those are kind of like larger scale pattern drivers. Whereas they certainly influence the pattern in summer, but also in summer, kind of localized current conditions can have a bit of an influence on the pattern, especially regionally. The reason is those larger scale drivers that I talked about, they're a little bit weaker in summer here in the northern hemisphere than they are in the winter. So these localized kind of conditions can have a bit more of an impact than they otherwise would in other seasons. So let's start with soil moisture. Where is the ground wetter or drier than normal? Much drier than normal across most of the West, a good portion of the Midwest, and even parts of the Northeast. Much wetter than normal across parts of the South, the Gulf Coast into the Southeast, and then drier over Florida. So what does this kind of infer? If the soil is dry, the ground is dry, that can breed continued hotter and drier conditions just because it makes it very easy to heat up the ground. There's just less moisture getting kind of transported from the ground to the atmosphere. So where the ground is dry, that can be an indication of continued warm and dry conditions in the summer unless something else kind of counteracts that. Whereas wetter grounds has the opposite effect. When the ground is very wet, it's a little bit harder to heat up, and it transports more moisture into the air, which can result in more rain. So dry kind of begets continued dry, warm conditions in the summer, whereas a wet ground kind of gives us the opposite. It might indicate rainier and maybe slightly cooler conditions in the summer. So again, this is kind of a reflection of the ongoing pattern, the soil moisture, but it also kind of correlates with where the tropical thunderstorms suggest it might be warmer and drier out west. maybe a little bit more mixed on the East Coast and cooler and wetter across the South. Again, the big difference is the upper Midwest, where it's quite dry now, but the tropical thunderstorms suggest that it might not be as dry through the rest of the summer. Another thing we can look at is water temperatures near the coast. And again, cooler waters keep areas kind of near the coast a little bit cooler, might keep it a little bit less humid, whereas warmer waters can kind of do the opposite. They can keep you warmer and more humid. And they can also influence things like where cold fronts go and where tropical systems go. So a few areas I have highlighted here on the water temperature map surrounding North America that kind of caught my eye. We'll start with the warm waters across the northeastern Pacific south of Alaska. That can kind of support continued warm conditions out west, especially across the northern Rockies into Canada, kind of moving from west to east. The other area I have highlighted is the warmer water near Mexico. The monsoon is something that happens every summer in the desert southwest, and when those waters are warmer, that can correlate to a stronger monsoon with a little bit more rainfall. Again, they need the rainfall badly in the southwest. Moving east, we do have slightly cooler waters across a good chunk of the Gulf of Mexico towards the southeast coast, and that might point to a continued lack of excessive heat in that region. Whereas we have very warm waters across a good portion of the northern and northwestern Atlantic. That might support continued warmer, quieter weather towards New England, with perhaps more humid weather kind of getting guided around that towards the mid-Atlantic. So again, the water temperatures kind of jive with some of the other forcings that we've talked about, the tropical thunderstorms, the soil moisture, and they kind of support a bit of a continuation of what we've been seeing if they continue to influence the pattern. Another tool we can look at is analogs. What are analogs? This is when we take years with similar conditions to this year and kind of see what happens as we move those years forward. So here are the analogs for July and August of this year. And on the left, we have the temperatures. On the right, we have the rainfall. A couple things that stand out. Again, big area of warmth in the analogs out west, and a little bit cooler in the central part of the country, which I think is reasonable. Where the analogs differ a little bit is they're cooler up towards like the northern mid-Atlantic and New England. I don't know if I fully buy that, but aside from that area, the analogs are kind of a decent match to what some of the other things we're suggesting point to, and that's, maybe a little bit cooler across parts of the central part of the country, very warm out west. And in terms of rainfall, they can kind of argue for continued very wet weather across the Gulf Coast, also a good portion of the East Coast. So, in terms of, projects that require a lot of dry weather or, outdoor sporting events, it's possible that rain is a little bit more disruptive this summer than normal. Again, not that it'll rain the whole time. It never rains every day in the summer, but it'll probably be raining maybe a few times a week, a lot of weeks. So, we've kind of recently been having to plan around a lot of rain here in the mid-Atlantic into the Northeast. And that's something that may continue through July and August per the analogs. Analogs are a little bit more mixed towards the Ohio Valley, Great Lakes in terms of precipitation. And again, the signals there are mixed. So kind of leaning towards maybe near average precipitation, areas like Chicago, Detroit, Indianapolis, Columbus, Ohio. So again, kind of your typical, it'll maybe rain a couple times a week, might be some thunderstorms, but also a lot of dry weather mixed in as well. So again, the analogs in general mostly support some of the other ideas that we talked about, but maybe they're a little bit cooler along the East Coast into New England than some of the other things point to. And one more tool is, again, the models. Again, this is the same kind of blend of several different models run by a number of different national meteorological agencies. And on the left, you have the temperature forecast for the rest of the summer, July through September. It gives it to us in 3-month chunks. And on the right, we have the rainfall forecast from the models. So a couple things that stand out. This really does jive with a lot of the other stuff we talked about. It supports continued warm conditions out west through the upper Midwest into the Northeast, and cooler conditions kind of across the southern and central United States. And in terms of rainfall, supports continued dry weather across a good part of the West into the plains. mixed signals on the East Coast, although everything else kind of points to a more active pattern on the East Coast, and wetter towards the Gulf Coast. So kind of summing up everything that we've talked about through summer. So in terms of temperatures, we're favoring warm conditions to continue out west. And that'll probably leak into the northern plains, the upper Midwest, and the Great Lakes, warm conditions. And also pretty strongly favor warm conditions occurring in the Northeast, especially New England. Heading towards the Southeast, maybe the Ohio Valley towards the Gulf Coast, I'm expecting maybe more typical temperatures. So it'll be warm at times. It's summer, it's always warm at times, but we're not looking at weeks on end of excessive heat with no relief in that area. In terms of precipitation, again, looking like it'll generally stay dry out west. The desert Southwest might get a little bit of rain from that monsoon I talked about. And again, any rain they get is good. Heading towards the East Coast, think in general, the Southeast and the Mid-Atlantic stay pretty active. Same with the Gulf Coast. So rainy in that area at times, which again might put a damper in outdoor plans and outdoor work at times in those areas. Maybe a little bit more typical rainfall in New England, maybe not quite as wet as the Mid-Atlantic. And then into the Ohio Valley, Great Lakes, we're kind of, it's a mixed signal there in terms of rainfall. So thinking maybe near average rainfall in the Ohio Valley, Great Lakes. So not quite as dry as it's been in the Great Lakes, areas like Chicago that are in a bad drought, but also not especially wet either. And then, tropical influence heading into the peak of hurricane season will heavily drive rainfall as well, because one or two tropical systems can drop a lot of rain and kind of mess everything up. So speaking of, let's touch on the hurricane season real quickly. So here is what this hurricane season in the Atlantic has done so far. It's only June, so it's very early. Peak season is like mid-August through mid-October. So we're not in the peak of season yet. We've had 3 weak systems so far. We had Ana in May spinning around northeast of Bermuda. We had Tropical Storm Bill off the East Coast in June, didn't do anything, kind of zipped out to sea. And then we had Tropical Storm Claudette, made landfall in Louisiana just this last weekend, and then kind of moved through the southeastern United States and then off the East Coast. And all of these storms were weak, including Claudette, although Claudette did cause some flooding, some tornadoes that produced some significant damage, and unfortunately did result in several fatalities across the Southeast. So again, even weak tropical systems can be impactful. Before we kind of look ahead to this season, I do just want to briefly touch on last season. A record-breaking number of named storms, a record-tying number of major Category 3 or stronger hurricanes, and significant landfalls all over the place, from Central America to the Yucatan Peninsula to the United States. The Gulf Coast was especially hard hit. We had Hurricane Hannah hit Texas. Louisiana was extremely hard hit with 3 hurricanes, 2 of them major. Hurricane Laura hit near Lake Charles, and then in September, Hurricane Delta hit near Lake Charles, Louisiana, in the western part of the state. And then Hurricane, was it Delta or Ada? One of these Greek letters, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on this, but it hit eastern Louisiana as a Category 3 hurricane and did a fair amount of damage. Eastern Louisiana near New Orleans into like Mississippi and Alabama along the coast had a fair amount of wind and storm surge damage from that. And then Hurricane Sally hit the Florida Panhandle. So those are all Gulf Coast hits. So what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hurricanes hitting the Gulf Coast last year. Very, very active and damaging season for that area. And not to leave out the East Coast, we had a couple of impacts. Tropical Storm Faye hit New Jersey in July, brought some flooding rains. As tropical impacts go, wasn't too severe, but then Isaias in early August hit the Carolinas as a hurricane and then raced up through the Mid-Atlantic and into the Northeast and produced significant wind damage. A lot of trees down, power outages up and down the East Coast. Power outages were in the millions, and some of them lasted upwards of a week, along with flooding rain and dozens of tornadoes. So Isaias was probably the most impactful East Coast hurricane, especially from like Virginia points north, since Sandy in 2012. Do we expect something similar this season? Well, we'll get to that in a second. Here are the current conditions across the tropical Atlantic, kind of starting with water temperatures. So in general, the waters are a little bit warmer than average across the basin as a whole. However, they're much warmer outside of the tropics, and then in the tropics, like the Caribbean, across the kind of the southern portion of the Atlantic towards the Cape Verde Islands and Africa, and waters are a little bit more normal or even slightly cooler than normal. So water temperatures aren't screaming for an active season. They're not screaming for a quiet season either. But it's kind of a little bit more of a mixed signal in terms of activity than last year. So kind of looking at what we've, back to the MJO, the tropical thunderstorms. So again, recall that we're kind of thinking that there will be a fair amount of phases 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 this hurricane season. So what this graphic on the left shows is the blue is upward motion that can be favorable for increased tropical thunderstorms and increased tropical development. And phases basically 1, 2, 7, and 8 are the most favorable for tropical development across the Atlantic. Phases 4, 5, and 6 are less favorable. So again, we've kind of seen, or we're probably going to see a mix, because I think we'll see a fair amount of phase 1 and 2. But we'll also probably see it work through phases 4, 5, and maybe 6 at times as well. So the MJO is kind of giving us mixed signals. It says it'll be active at times if we are seeing some phases 1 and 2, but also it might not be quite as hyperactive as last season. And here's what the MJO has done over the spring and early summer so far, kind of in the middle, that graph. The numbers kind of represent the phase it's in. You can see the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 on that chart in the middle, and the line is kind of representing where the MJO has been over the last few months. And you can see we had a fairly robust passage earlier in the spring through phases 8, 1, and 2. And more recently, we had a passage through 4, 5, and 6, which, again, those are kind of the phases that I think we'll see a lot of this summer. Overall, this is a bit of a mixed signal for Atlantic hurricanes along with the water temperatures, but does suggest it's active at times. And again, what's a little bit concerning is the warmer waters are outside of the deep tropics. So, maybe storms aren't quite as explosive across the deep tropics, but they can still get quite strong as they move through these warmer waters outside of the deep tropics. So again, we can kind of do the same thing with analogs as we do with the temperature and rainfall forecast. And here are some analogs for the hurricane season. So what we have on the left is kind of the steering pattern or the pressure pattern, high pressure, low pressure. Whereas on the right, we have rainfall in our analog years during the peak of hurricane season. So again, kind of gives a mixed signal, but does suggest there may be some activity. So looking at the steering pattern, the analogs generally have kind of a stronger high pressure near Bermuda, which correlates to the warmer waters in that area. That might help pump up that high pressure a little bit through the hurricane season. So that pattern kind of tells us two things. It tells us if storms blow up quickly off the African coast, they might recurve to the east of that high pressure and just go out to sea. That is the ideal solution, is storms curving out to sea. However, it also suggests that storms that make it a little bit farther west will have to go closer to land if that high pressure is there, keeping them from recurving. So this does suggest some landfall potential, or a threat to land, from the Caribbean into the Gulf of Mexico and perhaps even the U.S. East Coast. It's possible we have some storms curving just east of the East Coast, but again, the pressure pattern does point to some concern for landfall, much like last year, from the Caribbean all the way into the United States. Whereas the rainfall kind of gives a mixed signal. It's a little bit drier across parts of the tropics, the Caribbean, and then out into the tropical Atlantic. And again, the waters aren't especially warm in that area yet, so maybe this is onto something. And then it does suggest increased rainfall and hence potential for tropical activity outside of the tropics, so parts of the Gulf of Mexico, parts of the Atlantic a little bit farther north, including near the East Coast and also out to sea. So the analogs, again, point to some potential for an active season, but it's a little bit more mixed than last year. They certainly do point to at least some landfall risk. And we can look at forecast models for hints on the tropical development as well. This is, again, just forecast rainfall from August through October, the peak of hurricane season. And a couple of things are interesting to me. So first of all, the wetter weather kind of across the eastern Indian Ocean and Africa might be a signal for increased or strong tropical waves coming off Africa that can eventually develop into storms. But again, it's a mixed signal because the models, much like the analogs, are a little bit drier across the tropical Atlantic, but you do see, either no color or a little bit of green outside of the tropics, suggesting that maybe we don't have as many long-tracked hurricanes across the deep tropics into like the Eastern Caribbean, but outside of there might be a fair amount of activity. So models, again, kind of pointing to some mixed signals. And, something else that's interesting is the models, what happens in the Eastern Pacific can kind of influence the Atlantic. If the Eastern Pacific has a very active season, it's hard for the Atlantic to have a very active season and vice versa. So last year's Pacific hurricane season, the Eastern Pacific wasn't all that active, even though it was very active in the Atlantic. And the models are kind of suggesting maybe a somewhat quiet season in the Eastern Pacific. There is a little bit of green in there near the Mexican coast, but otherwise, the models are kind of suggesting drier weather across the Eastern Pacific. So maybe that's a small signal for an active season across the Atlantic. So kind of summing up the Atlantic hurricane season outlook, between the current conditions, the analogs, and some of the models, I think there's a small lean towards an active season, but it's more mixed than last year. So it should not be as active as last year. And in terms of landfall risk, unfortunately, there is some signal that storms that make it into kind of the western half of the Atlantic will inevitably have to at least get close to land anywhere from the Caribbean into the Gulf of Mexico, along with perhaps the East Coast, especially the Southeast and maybe the Mid-Atlantic. If New England is kind of warmer, maybe a little drier, maybe that keeps storms away from New England. So, you can see our forecast numbers here on the bottom. So the averages are 14 named storms, that's a tropical storm or stronger, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. Those are the averages. The forecast for this, and just for comparison, last year's numbers are in the middle, where we had 30 storms, 14 hurricanes, and 7 majors. The forecast for this year is we're still going near to a little bit above average for named storms and hurricanes with near normal major hurricanes. So overall, still leaning towards a somewhat active hurricane season with some landfall risk, especially kind of like in August and September. However, probably not quite as bad as last season. So that's all we have for today. But we are always here for you at WeatherWorks, summer, winter. Always feel free to give us a call if you're a client or if you have interest in our service. And if you have any questions about the webinar or any long-range forecast, always feel free to give me an email at jimsullivan@weatherworksinc.com. All right, that's all for today. Thank you.